first thing, welcome everyone, and certainly welcome to Jono, who is joining us today for a great session on psychological safety and the relationship to high-performing teams. Before we get into the conversation, just a couple of things. At the Inclusive Leadership Institute, we are, of course, focused on the art and science of inclusive leadership. And in many respects, inclusive leaders or inclusive leadership is a series of practices that exists at the individual, team, and organization levels to create a culture where everybody, that enables everyone to thrive. And that's not an easy undertaking. And one of those undertakings is, of course, a focus on creating and bringing about psychological safety at every level of an organization and truly enabling the high performance that it can engender. Again, all not very easy feats, and this is why it's so important and a pleasure to have Jono here today, because psychological safety has become somewhat of a buzzword. A lot of attention goes into it, and oftentimes we are enamored with the science of it. But then there is a real question about, okay, so how do we actually make it happen? And that's a space that we want to lean into today a little bit. It's really a pleasure to have Jono, not only because he is a member of our faculty here, but also, the founder and managing director of Wellbeing Outfit, a partner in this with us in this undertaking. And what I think is important, that it's when we look at a concept like psychological safety, that we start with, and maybe that's the business anthropologist in me, that we actually step beyond the concept for a moment and anchor our exploration in a more experiential understanding of what we're actually talking about here. And Jono, that's where I think you have done a lot of work in just being able to take a sometimes lofty concept, certainly an important concept, and making it real for people and organizations. And that's such an art and such a niche expertise that I can't wait for us to explore.
Thank you very much.
That you've done some work to translate that, so maybe that's a great place to start.
Yeah, so firstly, can I just thank everybody for the opportunity to be with you. I think one of the amazing starting places here, Jorg, is this is a conversation that is happening globally right now. Right? It's happening in this room. We've got people from different countries, from different cultural backgrounds. And often we talk about the strain that came with COVID-19, and we don't talk enough about some of the gifts. Right. And one of those gifts is the comfort that we can have in having online conversations with people from different backgrounds, using kind of technology to explore concepts in deeper ways. So I just really want to open by thanking you and Christine and the wonderful team there for inviting us into the Inclusive Leadership Institute, and for everybody to participate in this. And I think what I'd really hope for here, which is part of psychological safety, is not having the answer. Right? It's actually genuinely a process and a leadership practice that says, in a world of high complexity, where there are multiple right answers, how do we bring people together and value their differing expertise to come up with an interesting answer that suits us? And so I'm hopeful in the time that we have with everybody here that we can kind of start experimenting with that and see what is there. But fundamentally, and the starting place here with Mentimeter and getting people to share is, psychology is a subjective experience. Right? My experience, by definition, is mine and mine to own. Other people need to acknowledge and say, yep, that's true, but we don't have to we don't have to have the same experience, and that's the wonderful thing about psychology. But there's this kind of very, very powerful word called safety at the end of it, which is probably the most basic of human desires. And so when we put those two together, what we're really talking about is a subjective emotional experience with a very, very concrete outcome being safety. And so with that in mind, I thought maybe we can kind of start with just actually going through and getting people's reflections using Mentimeter. For those that haven't used Menti, you'll see a code up there. So if you go into the URL menti.com, use the code up there 151941113 and answer those questions, and let's get a sense of how do we use this technology to get a very quick snapshot of where everybody's up to.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for, just highlighting about while people are putting some more answers into it, for highlighting the idea that a lot of what we're focused on is actually subjectivity, right? It's how we feel, right? We forget that sometimes because we look for formulas, we look for the answer, like you said. And we know how difficult it is to calibrate our own subjective experience with that of others, right? So it's actually a really important starting point from my perspective.
And it's a very different part, Jörg, to build on that to other areas of safety where essentially it's a common experience, right? If you look at safety in workplaces, you say if you're on a construction site and a hammer falls on your head, then the experience that you'd have, Jörg, is largely what we would expect the experience to have for me, right? We would say there is a commonality of experience that we want to prevent. And that therefore makes it like largely a predictable way of transferring knowledge, right? We assume those experiences the same. What I think is really fascinating and difficult around this space, and certainly my 25-year career plus in mental health and wellbeing, is how do we marry up commonality with the differing experience, and what does that mean? And so that's the exciting part of it. And as I said, I think we've had that very unique, we've had that unique time with COVID where we had a sense of a shared global experience of distress, but also recognising that everybody's experience was unique, and we had to listen more deeply to that. That the experience here in Australia was very different to colleagues I worked with in India, to places in Europe, to US, elsewhere. So that I think is a really interesting, again, gift that has come out of the last few years.
Yeah. What do you make out of the responses here? Because to some degree, I see a lot of commonality here as well in what it feels like to be at your best and not fearing social rejection or sanction.
Yeah, I come to this, I look at this through the lens of someone with a background of psychology, and my background in particular was developmental psychology. So I spent most of my early career working with young people who are suicidal. And if you kind of go back, there's a little bit of debate around this, but essentially people are born what they believe with two fundamental emotion sets, fear and love. And fear is what we often kind of characterize as negative emotions. Right? What we now know is the purpose of those fear-based emotions are to protect ourselves in the face of an external threat. Right? So how do I look after myself first and look after others second? The second, which is a really interesting phenomena of mainly in animals that are further along the evolutionary chain, if you want to look at it that way, is their survival strategy is the second set of emotions, which is love. That as we feel safe, our body and our brain naturally goes into love, which is what we think of as positive emotions. And what they believe the evolutionary purpose of love is to, in the face of threat, to protect others before you protect yourself. And as a species that is inordinately bad at surviving by ourselves, right? Love is our strategy for survival, right? Yeah. And so when I look at this, what do you see when people are not fearing social rejection? So social rejection, we now know through the limbic system, that there is a part of our limbic system that's highly alert to social rejection, because social rejection means death in our most primal brain.
Mhm.
Is when you remove that fear, what do people naturally experience? They experience love. They're able to elevate into a different mindset and a different orientation that allows them to solve problems with the interest of the group first rather than the interest of the self first. And so I think when we're looking at problems around psychological safety, that's really what we're coming to that's really concrete, right? If you put humans under high stress, if you put humans in fear-based conditions, their brain will override love and go to self-interest, and they'll look in what effectively will become a zero-sum game.
Mhm.
So you put you and I, Jorg, into a more threatening situation, which is about stress and fear, and we will naturally have a conversation of who survives.
Yeah.
If you make us feel safe, we'll naturally move into a conversation which is how do we both gain? So when we're solving complex problems, I think that's the most important starting point. Is this isn't because people are good or bad or have some capabilities. It's simply the state that we put them in, and once you put them in a different state, they solve problems differently. And so that was my big read. I'm really fascinated for you. You come from a different field to me. Where you went with that, Jorg?
Well, I mean, for me, it's less the psychology of it, but the social experience, right? And we know, like, I mean, what you said about fear and love is so fundamental to who we are. We are both, right? And we work in fear-based systems, and but we learned how to collaborate really well as a species, and that's what we're talking about here, right? That's the linkage to performance as well. What I find interesting here in these responses, and I love that loved is mentioned here, in one of the things that came out, that overall, when we don't have to fear social rejection or sanction, this is a liberating, some people use liberating experience. We universally, across cultures, gravitate towards that kind of an experience. And of course, kind of societies or cultures are also tied together out of a certain fear of social rejection. Social rejection, and fear of social rejection is actually a really powerful motivator. It's perhaps the most primal motivator of human beings, because we do need our social context to survive and thrive. And that's why we're talking about this here. But it's that fear of social rejection and sanction that engenders all kinds of behaviors at all kinds of levels.
Absolutely.
But I think what's important here is for this conversation, before we ask another question, is simply, if this is the state we want to enable for everyone in our organization, and of course, this is where the linkage to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness comes in, because depending on who we are and where we are and what social experience we bring, what our social identity is, we actually may feel a little more or less threatened, in our organizations. But I think it's a good starting point to think about that this experience that is described here on the screen is the kind of experience that we want to enable when we are talking about psychological safety, right? That's the state we want our people to experience across their social experiences, backgrounds, and identities. Now, the second question I think is important, if we think about this as an entry point, is how could others, your colleagues, your team members, your co-workers, know that you feel this way? And I find this a really important question, because, I mean, Jono, you get this question all the time. How do we measure psychological safety? How do we know that psychological safety exists or doesn't, or how can we tell? And it's actually a relatively simple answer. And the answer how you can tell is you are providing right now with what you're putting in. And
I think the important part of this in the context, Jorg, right, which is the famous saying, if we judge ourselves on our intent, we judge others on their behaviour.
Yes.
That humans And I like the first one is like ask me, but actually humans aren't very good at asking questions, right? Humans actually gain most of their information through very, very quick observation that communicates safety in a way that we know operates at a subconscious level. We've got, Danny Kahneman's famous book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, to really help many people understand how the fast brain actually makes most of our judgments for us. Absolutely. Before we even ask a slow question. So I think that's a really important one. How do people read it in a room? How do we have such a common experience of it? And then how do we overlay those behaviours with knowledge, which comes from actually asking, but I think the subjective experience of this is what I mean. I hear this all the time when we work with leaders. Right. Why didn't people want to talk to me? I don't understand why they found that conversation threatening. And it's largely because we see ourselves from that point of intent, and the others see us from that point of behaviour. Yeah. So it's an interesting space to be in.
It's interesting also because that fast brain processing is actually really effective when we work in relatively small and homogeneous and very predictable environments, social environments, where essentially my subjective experience is close to or similar to what others are experiencing. And that used to be our evolutionary condition as human beings, right? We grow up in small groups of people sharing a lot of the same habits and mindsets. But, now we are in this global environment with a tremendous amount of linguistic and cultural diversity. And all of a sudden, that feature of the brain doesn't serve us so well anymore. So that's why asking questions is really good. But, like you said, we rely on that fast processing brain. So I want to, it's interesting because here we got 11 answers. We got 26 on the first question. We'll leave it up for just a moment. But I just want you to read the question again. How could others tell or know that you feel this way, the way we described earlier when you don't have to fear social rejection, right? And so a couple of things: being vulnerable, where you are vulnerable, where you are more engaged and happy, where you show interest and curiosity. And I just want to highlight how important those things are, because when we want to gauge whether an environment, a team, an organization has or doesn't have psychological safety, or the degree to which this exists, we are asking a qualitative question, right? Because psychological safety is a subjective experience. The way we can tell this is through the qualities that people exhibit in that environment and the degree to which they exhibit it, and whether this is a shared manifestation, or whether only some people manifest these kind of anchors. But those are the kind of things that we need to pay attention to. And in a way, we all, as individuals, and especially as leaders, we are a walking barometer for how psychologically safe do my people feel.
Absolutely.
So I think, just to complete our initial exploration, because we're getting to the heart of some questions. What is it, right? How do we know it exists or manifest it? And the third question is and this is, again, based on your experience, when you feel the absence of fear, essentially, so from social sanction or from rejection, and you feel the way you just described earlier, what conditions need to be in place for you to feel this way? And I'm inviting you to be very specific, very specific about what helps you. And there may be some very, very specific things that people can say or do, or places where you are versus where you're not at, that help you to feel psychologically safe. So trust, love and trust. So essentially, it's when it's a reciprocal experience, right? You experience that love energy perhaps, and you respond in kind. We're very reciprocal in how we operate as human beings. So what I'm hearing, what I would make out of this one is actually that in order to create psychological safety, we need to give it. Right? We need, I mean, it's almost like people will mirror what we extend. What else are you seeing in this these responses, Jono?
Well, I think the big focus here, Jorg, is around behaviour, and what we often miss in some of these things is the symbols in the environment. And I'll give you a very tangible example. I started my career working, so I specialise in suicide prevention, young people. Started my career working, interviewing kids in juvenile justice. And certainly true in Australia, I imagine many other places, about 90% of all kids in juvenile justice detention centres have experienced some form of abuse at some point in their life, 90%. And remember, the psychologist who was training me gave me the most powerful lesson, and he said, no matter what you've seen on television, you never close the door. I was like, but isn't this supposed to be, I was like, young and like, oh, I'm going to follow all the rules, right? And it confused me because it's like, hold on, isn't this supposed to be a confidential conversation? And he said, if they close the door, they have the power. The confidentiality isn't yours, the confidentiality is theirs. And the symbol, he said, what happens to anyone who's experienced violence in their life is the more powerful person closes the space. And it was the best lesson I ever got around the power of symbols, who gets to close the door, who sits, just a really simple thing of like, if you sit down at a table and you're having a difficult conversation with someone, often the person who's more junior walks into the room first out of respect and they sit away from the door. The person who's the most senior comes in second, and what do? They sit opposite them out of respect, which generally means they block the door. Automatically, that space becomes more unsafe. And so one of the things that I'm kind of, reflecting on here is how much we focus on what we do, and we tend to underestimate, how do we set up the space? Sorry, there's a plane going overhead. How do we think about our power, our location? Yeah, we know height matters. If the angle is looking down on someone, there's a fear response elevated. And a lot of these things are things that we would naturally miss because we just think it's a conversation. So that probably the one thing I would say to people is when we think about psychological safety, think about it in its broadest context. For me, understanding of kids in juvenile justice have a fundamentally different worldview of trust of adults in authority. And as much as I think of myself as a lovely human being who is there to care, that wasn't generally their experience of adults. And how you set up space matters, how other people view you. And so therefore, my experience of psychological safety as a leader or as someone with authority, you've got to do a lot of research around how the other person may view you, not how you view yourself. And I'd say that's, how do you view the space? How do you view the room? Do you invite clients and customers to your office and your power centre, or do you go to theirs? A simple act, do you leave people in the waiting area of your office, or do you go down and greet them in the lift and have a cup of coffee together? How do you create space actually is a really important marker of safety that we just tend to overlook because it's not how we view ourselves. So that's probably my one thing. If I think about conditions, my brain immediately went to concrete conditions as well as behavioural.
And I really resonate with what you just said, because as leaders, we need to be curators of those spaces that we, for ourselves, for our teams, right, for our organizations. And this just doesn't extend the physical space, even the virtual space now, right? And how do we operate in that? But I think this is probably one key insight already, that as a leader, I need to be that curator in a way. I need to think about the subjective experiences, allow variation, not assuming that, you know, my subjective experience is a reliable guide to that of others, you know, especially in a diverse context. We fully can't make that assumption. And that I invest myself in creating the conditions, various different aspects of the conditions that enable people to feel what I want them to feel ultimately. I'm really tempted. I mean, I love what people have written here, right? Safe to make mistakes and learn from them. And that needs to be modeled sometimes. Sometimes it's the leader who needs to model the making of mistakes and the learning from mistakes, guidance and support, curiosity. I don't know if you want to comment on anything that people have written in here right now.
Well, they're all things and all behaviours designed to create a collaborative experience in a complex environment, right? So you go back to our fundamental emotion sets. If you have fear, and stress is simply the expression of fear for most people. When most people say I'm stressed, they're really saying I'm afraid, right? So as you elevate out of that, what I kind of see here, which is that people are entering into that love space where we're trying to solve problems with the group, and we're trying to orientate power and authority to get to those sort of solutions. So that's sort of the big thing for me, y'all. How do we create that space where people are orientating their neurochemistry towards solving problems in that particular way?
Yes.
And also, how do we consciously leave those environments, right? Because what we also know that if you actually need people to execute what they already know at speed, right, do something really efficient that they're already very good at that doesn't require collaboration, actually fear-based emotions are pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So one of those things I think as leaders is also like, when do we need to kind of pull the pin, not on safety, but on the clarity of like, actually, let's just kind of get ahead, right? And then, the part for me that I think is really interesting is like, how do you actually, as a group, consciously tweak the conditions? And we see that in offices, at least in Australia all the time, particularly pre-COVID, of how did people communicate that they wanted to be executing is they wore big noise-cancelling headphones in an open space. And so what they were really saying is, I don't want to become part of this community at the moment. I need to be self-interested, execute my work. And if people respect that, that's good. And then how do you invite people into a collaborative space? And so I think it's actually the movement in those spaces that also becomes really, really important. And we can often mix those up. If someone's super stressed and they've got a deadline in an hour, actually inviting them into these spaces in and of itself can be stressful, right? And that's, again, I think a mistake that a leader can make, which is are you emotionally up for what we need to do at this point? And that becomes part of psychological safety. It's like, can that person step out of the group without being rejected by the group?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, I'm sure everyone's experienced, we sit in the room going, I'd rather be somewhere else. I really need to do something else, but I can't tell the group.
Yes.
So again, I think as leaders, how do you actually just make the delineation between, can you exit the group without being rejected from the group? And what are the ways in which we do that, and how do we kind of have that free movement of cognitive attention?
Yeah, I love that view, because we spend a lot of time, how do we include people and bring them in? But that's part of inclusiveness, right? Is also to make it safe to exit when you need and rejoin and build that into how we operate. But many people don't think about that element, right? I love that you point that out. But I know that you have, I mean, if we elevate the conversation, if we move a little further, I am interested. You have a very specific answer and point of view to the issue. Why is focusing on psychological safety now so important, above and beyond COVID, potentially. I mean, that was our entry point here as well. But I think there are other things happening in this world and in the world of performance and organizations that we need to factor into this our understanding.
Yeah, I think absolutely. There are a couple of really big trends that we need to understand. The first is that we are on the long tail of COVID, and COVID is a form of psychological crisis. It's a shared experience that's not dissimilar to a war or a massive kind of global economic meltdown like a Great Depression, where we have a shared emotional experience to an event. And what we know about the psychological stages of those are after the crisis, you have a period of what we call psychological renewal before you hit psychological steady states. And that's true for any crisis. Happens after a death. We go through a sudden loss, we hit crisis, we operate very, very efficiently out of our fear brain. So most people in the early phases of COVID, the most common thing for me is like, how productive are my people? Like, how much work can they get through? And the answer was they can, because they're in a mass anxiety state, right? They're trying to control something. As you move out of that, and what we know is this renewal phase is not a steady state identity. It's largely a rejection of crisis. So most people's identity in workplaces are, I want to be the opposite of what I was. So we know more about what we want to leave behind, but we're not yet sure of who we want to be at an identity level. And I think a lot of the conversations around what's the point of the office, what's the nature of the work, how do we work together, are really fundamental questions about our identity at work that became very unstable over 3 to 4 years. Certainly if you operate in the cognitive workforce, right, where fundamentally your job is about monetizing your time and your brain rather than your fingers and your hands. So that's a really important one, because it lends itself to psychological safety, which is actually we're solving a complex problem on how are we going to define work and where we do it and what it means, right? And to do that, we therefore need to have a shared agreement with our colleagues of how are we going to operate before we start solving problems together. So I think that's the first thing that we really underestimate in organisations, which is we need to have and develop a shared way of being with our colleagues that was essentially ripped apart for 3 years, and we haven't put it back together in a way that's entirely stable. My take is it will probably take us at least another 1 to 2 years before we reach a period of stability around that. Some of the things are settling into place, but not all. And then the second thing is that we are now, according to World Economic Forum, fairly deep into the AI industrial revolution, so what they call the fourth industrial revolution. And what that really means is that over the coming particularly 3 to 4 years, AI will do repetitive cognitive tasks far better than humans. And so in our human workforce, we will value non-repetitive cognitive tasks. So the skills that they believe will increasingly be valued are less about hard work, efficiency, all the things that probably most of us were valued through career, into things that were traditionally viewed as soft skills. Right? So adaptability, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, curiosity. Those skills that were genuinely viewed as non-technical and nice to have are what we're really seeing as the skills that will be most valued in this AI industrial revolution that's coming on quick. And so the question is, well, we actually historically haven't recruited for those. We certainly haven't nurtured those, in our leadership workforce. So in most organisations, they're overweight on skills like technical capability, efficiency, hard work, effort, time management, those things. And they tend to be underweight on skills like adaptability, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, curiosity. And so what we know, again, going back to cognitive science, is that high levels of well-being are a cognitive precondition to performing those new skills well. So if you assume that the World Economic Forum's right, and you assume that AI will do repetitive cognitive tasks better than humans, and therefore we will value humans' ability to do non-repetitive cognitive tasks in a collaborative way with other humans, solve really complex problems that we're not really sure about the answer when we go into it, right? Then we actually are required as a form of competitive advantage to invest in people's well-being. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really, really fundamental shift, Jorg, from the way in which well-being has traditionally been viewed, which is either it's unimportant, it's a trade-off for performance, right? If performance goes up, well-being should go down. We tend to venerate leaders who are known to sleep 4 hours a night and always work and do all these things that sacrifice well-being. Yes. So those leaders will look, I think, very odd in this kind of new work environment. And so that's really, really an interesting trend that we're really at the cusp of, which is that if organisations are going to operate very well in an AI era, then we have to understand that cognitive science requires high levels of well-being to trigger the sorts of capabilities that the ones are going to be more valued. And so as our stress levels increase, people become less able to perform those skills well. And so that's a really interesting kind of context around this. And it means, and you'll see there, that we have to really think about what are the components of productivity that are going to be different. Probably the biggest one I'd say, Jorg, that's coming through in the data and the evidence is how much we've underweighted the importance of individual well-being to collective conversations. Yeah. So go back to my example with the kids I worked with in juvenile justice, right? They're not coming to that conversation, no matter my intent to build a bond and connection, with any great state of well-being. They're coming into a heightened state of fear with high levels of cortisol. So they're coming to the conversation at a cognitive disadvantage. And that's true. We know that in teams, that if people haven't slept well, if they're stressed at home, if they've got economic considerations, what happens in the meeting, what happens in the room is actually guided by what's happening to people outside. But we tend to discount that. We tend to massively overweight what happens in the room and underweight the people's capability of bringing that. We know that, a really interesting piece of data, that you are more likely to be sentenced to a long prison sentence by a judge if they're hungry, right? Because they're really angry and frustrated and they just want to get to lunch. So there's a really kind of interesting insight that actually levels of hunger lead to increased frustration, increased selfish behaviour, leads to kind of bad outcomes. So the point being is individual wellbeing is incredibly important to psychological safety, and we tend to really underestimate it. The second kind of part being actually what happens with the group. Do we have clear rules? All the work that you do in anthropology, what are our symbols? How do we create safety? What is the room? All those things that are really important that we tend to focus on. And then the third is, are we actually clear that we're solving common problems? Are we aligning our efforts towards a common direction, and do we capture that? Because what I would say is, if you look at high-performing, high-wellbeing teams, they're ones where people are individually bringing their best self to work and being clear about it and investing in their wellbeing in a very deliberate way. Mm-hmm. They're very clear on how they work together, and then they spend a lot of time solving the right problems so that when they put their emotional effort into things, they're leaning in the same direction. Generally, teams of low psychological safety don't check in on each other's individual wellbeing, right? So they just assume what happens in the room. They have got very unclear rules of how to be safe. And they just assume that their problem is everyone else's problem, right? And so you look at that and go, they're actually just good people pulling in different directions. And that's often where we go astray when we deal with complexity.
So what I find before we actually explore, what we can do about it and how we tackle this, I just want to make sure I understood correctly. And please, anybody who has joined us today, please use chat or so if you have specific questions or feedback that this triggered. But I'm imagining this state, and I believe that's true from a lot of the client work that we've been doing, that we are emerging from this shared trauma experience and many people psychologically just want to pretend that it hasn't happened, right? Or that it's now beyond us, and we still feel and carry the traces of that. But that many leaders are actually not using this time to do what you talked about as the shared agreement on how we operate together.
Yeah.
Actually have that conversation. And to me, it's actually how we will operate together.
Yes.
Because flexibility at the individual level, as great as it is, it doesn't give us that concerted, calibrated way of working together, which is the whole reason why we're in an organization. Because we want to perform, we want to achieve something together, not as individuals necessarily. And that's a discussion that I don't see happening too often. When it happens, it is generally very shallow, or it doesn't happen because somehow the mantra from the top leadership is we all have to get back to work or something like this and back into the office and let's do it the way we used to do it. There is something that we need to do that we're not doing. And then AI is coming the other way and actually challenging every single assumption we have implicitly and explicitly embedded about people and work in our organizations. And
absolutely,
I think the potential to get totally misaligned and mess this up is very high. And the big call that you're making here as well is let's focus. I mean, let's understand that well-being and is a strategy. Not just something nice for individuals, but it's a performance strategy, and that is what anchors psychological safety for all as the very precondition. Because without it, we will not be able to be adaptable in this new age.
Absolutely, and that is the work that we do at the Wellbeing Outfit. How do we align high wellbeing and high performance?
Yeah.
When you actually look at the history of most management practice, particularly through the 20th century, they were really built around how do we utilize fear to drive performance.
Yes.
Right? And largely the mindset there was if we get people to be afraid, they'll be compliant and they'll do repetitive cognitive tasks for a long period of time. And then we can, if they're doing repetitive cognitive tasks, then we can swap in another unit of production, being another person, to do the same repetitive cognitive tasks. Right, so you look at a lot of the practices I hear from leaders. I want to walk the floor. I want to see my people. We talk often in some organizations about people as rank, right? They're this rank, they're that rank. So a lot of the language in management practice in the 20th century has really been built around a time where actually productivity and fear were pretty well aligned.
Yeah, that's true.
Because we needed lots of humans to execute repetitive cognitive tasks. And as I said, if you look at how the brain works under high levels of stress, it likes doing repetitive cognitive tasks. So you train people very well to have specific expertise, put them under stress, get them to repeat those same processes. They're pretty good and they can do it for quite some time. The trouble that we're in now, which is we're trying to solve complex problems, right? And we have this other kind of big trend that you spoke about, which is AI is going to do just some of that work for us over time, right? And so that's then really the question of what do we need our people to do differently and how do we invest in them differently? And that's the kind of the fascinating space I think a lot of leaders are just starting to catch up on. Because to your point, it challenges most of their work experience where a lot of them would say, it's really important to sacrifice your well-being in your 20s. So you show the work that you're willing to go over and above.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the language is very odd language in the models that we're seeing. So now it's really about shifting the idea of productivity to solving a lot of the problems that we see emerging in the workplace.
Well, I think, because I think you're so right that the systems we've built at work are fear-based systems. And I think they feed on insecurity, conformity, belonging anxiety. All of those things are actually almost baked into the organizational assumptions. And the opportunity we have now as leaders and in our organizations is to not only create shared agreements of how we operate together, but to actually transform those very systems and the assumptions they are based on. And I see that's ultimately the work of inclusive leaders, as well as more progressively aligned DE&I functions, actually, to be that catalyst, the enablers of those changes. I don't know if you have specific thoughts on that, but where I want to take our conversation next is actually, so what does that mean in practice? I mean, this may sound really good and make sense, but how do we, as we're dialed in here in our respective contexts, what can we do to actually put these ideas into action?
Yeah, so I think the first part, and this is a model that we use with clients, right? So which is, how do you actually, before you have an action bias, actually just assess where you're up to, right? How do you pause? And how do you look at it at the three drivers of psychological safety, or what's happening at an individual level, what's happening at a team level, and what's happening at a system level, right? What's the environment that we're operating in as a team? So they're always the three levers that you can pull on. In the preparation phase, it's actually, all right, are we really clear as to the individual enablers? If you look at that, as I said, I've spoken a little bit about physical wellbeing, sleep, diet, home stress, economic stress. These things do make quite a significant difference in terms of how the brain operates, and we tend to underestimate that. What we want from our people is to be able to share those things and say, hey, look, everything's okay at work, but actually things at home are really stressful and I may not be my best over the next couple of days, because then everyone else can make allowances for that in the team. Or I've got young children and I haven't slept very well in the last, 5 years. Can you help me along? Right. So what is it that people are able to share, which is that help others contextualize their behavior and also help them, but also manage those things really well? At a team level, it's really, well, what are we seeing operating in the team? And I think, there's a pretty knowledgeable group when they talk about psychological safety and trust. And what we know from particularly Amy Edmondson's research is that the drivers here are really what I would call trust and stretch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So trust being, can I be vulnerable with this group without being socially rejected when I don't get things right? My kind of sense here, you're going to love other people's thoughts on this, is we've massively overweighted or taken out a bumper sticker here of speak up culture. Right, so if people are okay, if people are safe to speak up, then we must have psychological safety. That's actually relatively unusual in a lot of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so speaking up to power in a number of cultures is viewed as actively rude and culturally inappropriate. So when we're trying to encourage or see speaking up as our goal and measuring speaking up, then we can actually, unfortunately, trigger less safety with people, because they're saying we're asking for a behaviour that people feel is culturally inappropriate and more difficult. It biases people who are highly verbal, who, in an Australian context would have English as a first language. So it actually, when we focus on speaking up, then often we can actually create some mistakes. What we want to focus on is a contribution culture. Does everyone feel safe to contribute in a way that's meaningful for them, and can the leader adjust their style to seek different contributions? And so that may mean in a meeting, for example, that you say to people, I'll send out the agenda beforehand. I'll ask those that want to have a more deliberate approach to just go around the room and give me your opening thoughts on the question that may be written down, that may be verbal, but you allow people time to prepare, rather than just say, okay, everybody, what's your opinion on subject X? Right? How, as a leader, do we really focus on contribution, not speaking up?
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think it's the most fundamental error that we've seen that I see in psychological safety is we focus too much on that. So the first part is contribution. Does everybody feel safe enough to contribute? Do we trust our colleagues enough? The second mistake that I think we make there is trust and likability are different. Right? I can like my colleagues, but I don't necessarily trust them. But I can also trust someone I don't like. So I can say, look, you and I may or may not get along socially, but I can say, look, I would trust Jorg as a matter of ethics, that if I tell him something in confidence, he wouldn't betray that confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so often in organisations, we focus on social harmony and likability. We have great team lunches and great end-of-year functions, but we don't trust our colleagues to solve complex problems. So measuring trust, not likability, is a really important thing. And then the third kind of part that we look for in terms of that team, which is the extent to which the team focuses on solving emotionally effortful problems. And so what we're actually asking people to do is experience discomfort. And I'd say the third mistake I see in organisations when we look at this is we often hear people say, I feel uncomfortable, therefore I'm unsafe. Right? I'm having a difficult performance conversation with you. I'm unsafe now. So no, you're not unsafe. You're uncomfortable. There's a difference. So what we see in highly psychologically safe teams is they actually spend a quite large amount of their time in discomfort, solving complex problems where they feel at the edge of their capabilities, but at no time do they feel as if they're socially rejected. And so that's a really important kind of part, which is if you bring those three things together, then what you want is a group of high trust. You want a contribution culture, and you want to spend most of your time on emotionally effortful problems that carry high risk. If you're doing that, you've got an outstanding team. To do that, people have to individually look after their own well-being to be at their best to do that. Can be quite emotionally exhausting to do that. And then the organisation has to wrap around that team a space to allow them to do that. And so, often you can put a team in a different environment and a different organisation, you'll get very drastic. Right? So if I look at the three phases, like actually how do we understand ourselves, understand the dynamics, the biases of our team, the cultural differences, just sit and understand, share. How do we then start to operationalise some of those practices? And once we're really good at that, some of the things concretely, do you have a team kind of charter? Like, do you have an agreed way of being? Do you operate with a sense of kind of clarity? And then once you kind of do all those, then you can then go, okay, what are the problems we're going to solve, knowing that we're absolutely confident that we can solve them with the group sticking together under high strain, which is really kind of what you want. So they're the three phases that we always look at. And I think the big thing here is it's not going to be quick, right? You've got to invest in it. Everybody's got to lean into it. You can destroy it very quickly, but my experience is you've got to put a lot of effort into it and nurture it over quite an extended period of time and just understand the science and skill. Because when you start losing it, it's important to understand the drivers of why we're losing it. Is it because the organisational environment's changed and we need to concentrate on that? We're pretty good. Is it because people are individually under stress? Or is it because the team dynamics have gone funky? If we don't actually understand those three things, then we can actually overweight an area of problem that doesn't actually really exist.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I know we are. It's amazing how quickly an hour goes by, right? When we have this kind of a conversation. I'll just encourage people to raise any questions or comments you might have. Put it in chat or so. I'm just curious how to imagine. I mean, so this takes a long-term commitment. We know this. When I look at this, I think about even the almost institutionalizing the practice of what I call cultural dialogue. Right? The cultural dialogue is a way in which we together in a group, maybe a group of leaders at the team level, actually explore our culture together in an attempt to optimize it in a way that gives all of us a better subjective experience and ultimately achieves well-being for us as a team, as an individual. and helps us align or do what we are here to do, right?
Mm.
And I love the that we need to when we have those cultural dialogue. And this is obviously not a one-time thing. It's something that we need to practice, cultivate over time. To disassociate those trust from likability, speaking up versus contribution. That clearly resonates with some here, as I can see. And discomfort from a lack of safety, disassociating those, because that's a common confusion, right? And actually, addressing them, discussing them, agreeing to them is such a powerful way of furthering that sense of safety within the team. Anything else that you would recommend? I mean, when I think about this, what would you recommend people to tactically start with? Where do we start in something like this?
Yeah, so I think the first is to in the prepare phases, we really need to build the capability and understanding of our leaders and those in our environment around some of these kind of concepts and the science that sits behind it. Because we've done that really well in safety. If I go back to wellbeing, we're pretty comfortable now that if you work in a physical job like construction, that actually you have a workplace responsibility to not drink alcohol and not be affected while at work. Mm-hmm. But we haven't really taken that into the cognitive workforce, right? What is my obligation as an individual to look after my wellbeing? If I'm an executive, so if I go really concrete, if I'm a global executive and, I've flown across 3 or 4 time zones and then I've got a meeting at 9 a.m. when I'm really severely jet lagged, what is the cognitive impairment that I'm facing at that point, right? Is that an appropriate decision? And that's really about when I talk about the science of wellbeing, I think we're going to have to get a lot more concrete around what does that mean? How do we, how do we do that for this workforce? I think the second really concrete thing that I would say that we work with teams on, which is, are we measuring the right things? My experience with a lot of culture surveys is a lot of culture surveys really preference harmony over psychological safety, right? And a lot of leaders are rewarded for the absence of obvious problems, right? Whereas actually in highly psychological safe teams is there's actually quite a lot of disharmony, but it's safe. Right, there's a sense of kind of stretch and rub and people kind of going out of they're quite kind of fractious rooms in many senses. So I think the thing I always look at, particularly for those who work in people and culture, of actually are we measuring and rewarding the right things for our leaders? And then, the third really concrete thing that I'd certainly, look at is how do we build up these shared practices across the organisation that allow individuals to move between groups, because that's the key in big organisations. I think the Google Aristotle study showed this really well, which is some senses there's no such thing as an organisational culture that's homogenous. There is a coming together of lots of team cultures and an organisational identity that's a kind of a golden thread. And what we really want in organisations is an ability for people to move across these mini cultures as they change teams, and to do that at speed, so that if I join the Inclusive Leadership Institute and I'm attending my first meeting, my fundamental question is how do I know how to be great in your team? Mm-hmm. Because if I spend 6 months sitting there going, well, I can't say anything, then we just lose a lot of contribution. Right. And so when I look at it, they're the things that I really focus on, of how do we create a way in which people can move safely between teams to enable contribution really quickly, solving complex problems.
And I love that point, because this has been a real struggle in my work especially with leaders on their understanding of culture, which they're presiding over in a sense, right? They are, and as some people have said, that's the most important thing leaders do, actually, to create culture. But it doesn't mean that they just create one culture, right? It creates and I find it very hard to work with executives who have this notion of there is one culture. and where the description of their culture even becomes kind of an exercise in executive aesthetics, where it has to fit certain adjectives. But actually, I love this idea of, are we creating various different cultures that are aligned to what these groups need to do, and are we creating interoperability? And that requires a very different way of thinking about what we're doing. I want to make sure, thank you for sending in your comments and questions, and please continue to do that. We'll explore some of them here because we have a little more time. But there is one question that comes in. I'll just read it out loud. I'd love to hear some words about psychological safety for underrepresented groups in the organization. And obviously, that's a really important concern when we're thinking about operating in a diverse, environment. Whether it's locally diverse, globally diverse. But what about, minorities and underrepresented groups from within your discussion right now?
Yeah, so I'll preface it of like the deep irony of being kind of a middle-aged guy talking about underrepresented groups. So I'm going to put that kind of irony, if people won't mind, to one side. And I think we go to the evidence. What does the evidence tell us? So the first thing is that we know about safety is, well, what are the symbols that I'm likely to be safe within this group? So I did, for example, my early research was on the causes of suicide in the LGBTI community, one of the first Australian studies. And one of the questions that I asked was, for a young person whose identity is not disclosed, they're actually remarkably safe. Right. So the risk comes at the point of disclosure. So the question was like, how do I know when it's safe to disclose? And the interesting thing came, and I was working with young people, is like they often went, but there are posters of diversity around the building. So it didn't matter that it was around sexual orientation or diversity in that respect. So if leaders or teachers or others talk genuinely in an inclusive way, then they took that as code that this is a place that is likely to be inclusive of me, and therefore I can take a social risk. So again, I kind of come back to that. How do we create the circumstances for inclusivity of groups and individuals who don't come from the dominant group? Right. And that's not necessarily just in kind of culture. It can come from language. It can come from, the size of the business, and outsider in the business, a whole range of things. Is, well, what are your symbols that allow that person to get a coded read before they even enter the room? And what does that look like? How do people use language? They're really, really important things. I think the second thing that we know, which comes from the evidence, is, do the leaders talk about difference in expertise? So one of the things that I would kind of say for someone who, in a diversity sense, say is new to the organisation, so you've got a very established team, and that person may feel afraid to speak up, is an easy thing for the leader to say is, you're new to our team. Your expertise is that you are not one of us. I would love to hear your thoughts based on your expertise as to how you would solve this problem, because we're at a disadvantage, which is we are more likely to think alike. As soon as you say that as a leader, you're communicating to everybody that you value difference of expertise. And then it invites other people to say, my expertise is that I come from, that I grew up in this country and came to that country. Okay, great. Or my expertise is I speak multiple languages, or my expertise is that I'm this age. So when you think about, I would say that the key thing here for a leader is inviting people in and being very express in the idea of difference of expertise. We see this in the mental health and suicide prevention movement, that those with a lived experience of suicide have a different expertise to a psychiatrist or a psychologist who's trained in mental health. they're no greater or worse, but it's important that we come together and that all that expertise is valued. So when you think like that, it's relatively easy to just keep inviting people into the room, right? Because I then feel more comfortable say, well, my expertise is this. Can I contribute in this way? It also just allows people to be clear as to when can I be invited in and get a sense that the group is super excited. So I think that would be my two ones. What are the symbols around that the leader and the organisation can communicate that says everybody's welcome here? How do we create the spaces where people kind of do those things, and how do we kind of value expertise? And sometimes they're not very complex. I remember when in my organisation, one of the best things that we did is we had a lunch once a year and everybody brought a dish from their culture of origin, however they defined it. And they were always the best conversations because it allowed people just to go, this is something I now am able in a really interesting way to say, this is who I am. This is part of my identity that you may not see. So I think there are very concrete ways and great ways in which people can create that inclusive experience. But ultimately, I think it's about valuing expertise and symbols.
I know we are a little over our time, but it's just too good of a discussion. So I'd love to take one more comment that we'll see in chat for now. And I know if you need to leave us because of time constraints, then please do. But I just think there is a lot in this final conversation, and maybe we can take another 5 minutes on that before we close. But and I'll just summarize a little bit what I read this comment to be. And this is about how do we actually, in a complex global organization that is, how do we cascade a lot of this, right? Especially when a lot depends on individual attitudes, individual recognition, individual awareness even. How do we cascade organizational culture around this? And I think it's such a great question because it's the biggest conundrum in my work, actually, that we are oftentimes speaking and engaging with individuals, sometimes with teams, but they're part of incredibly vast organizational systems, and we're trying to make a culture change. Any thoughts on that? I know it's the impossible question probably, but I just love to hear your take on it. And I also want to say this is opening a conversation in many respects, right? I mean, there are so many aspects to this. And I really appreciate the engagement and the thoughtfulness that comes through the questions. But I just love for us to explore a little bit, how do we actually change and shift culture of kind of a massive organizational environment?
Part of the reason that I spend so much time talking about the science and performance is the time I spend and have experienced as a CEO, which is if we want something to sit at the executive table, we have to understand that the CEO's fundamental responsibility is the performance of the business.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so when we talk about some of these things about we care about our people, it's good for our people, it's part of the employee value proposition, then I think unconsciously for the senior leaders and the CEO and the board is like, let's delegate that to people and culture to solve. Right? But it's not really about performance, right? It's not. So the starting point for me, if you want to cascade this across the organisation, then I would kind of root it where we've had the conversation today, which is this is about the future of your business. If fundamentally you're in a business where a huge degree of the value of the business is monetizing people's brains and time, right, then you have to be really good at this, right? This is going to be increasingly the source of your competitive advantage or disadvantage, in the same way that having an efficient supply chain is part of the structural advantage of businesses. as part of having a really great technology strategy or any other kind of key strategy of performance. So I think that's what I would say. Often these conversations are locked in the people and culture crowd, right? Who to some extent were a bit too devoted to the idea of really great cultural workplaces. Like and we believe that it's an end in and of itself, and we accidentally alienate others who are really more interested in performance.
Mm-hmm.
We also, I think, have to kind of keep challenging that most of our senior leaders in global are really doctored into leadership practices and training that were built for a different era. And so some of this feels very odd and uncomfortable and not particularly useful. And so how do we really kind of engage to do that? And I think the third part that I would say, which is we just have to get far better at measurement and longitudinal measurement and show that it works.
Yeah.
Right. Unless we show that it works at a performance level, I think what you always run the risk of is disinvestment, or not necessarily disinvestment over time, but you get chaotic investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And that doesn't create the sustainable impact. Right?
No, certainly not when you're talking about organisational levels. So I think that's kind of one, my expectation is that we are really at the start of this. I look at this and, if you go back to the 1990s, hardly any organisations would have had a CIO or a CTO, right? And it's now built in. Right. So I think what we will expect to see, my role at EY Oceania is Chief Mental Health Advisor. I think we'll expect to see that around the leadership table are people with deep expertise in psychological sciences. That's different than people in culture expertise. They may be one and the same, but they're different. And I think we'll see an ecosystem of advisors who are helping organisations navigate this in the same way that we're very comfortable that we would have a chief counsel, legal counsel, and we have law firms who support us. Yeah. That this is such a deep capability in our business that we need internal expertise and we also need fractional advisors. So I think that's a really great challenge for this community to take forward. How do we put it in a language with a level of science that says, actually, let's recognise that the CEO and others' fundamental responsibility is performance, and then let's articulate it in performance language. Let's measure it against performance, and then let's bring in the right capability to execute it so that it works for individuals and us. Because the great result is this is better for people anyway. People are happier.
True.
Right? So
Yes.
People are not going to go, wow, why are you doing that, right? But we have to argue that it's not only good for our people, that's actually good for business performance. And I think there's still quite a lot of quiet scepticism out there that this is more than another feel-good measure that's part of our employee value proposition, but probably a cost line more than an investment line.
Fabulous. Let's stop here. Only in this conversation, because there is clearly a lot more to explore, but even more to do, in a sense, for this community. And I think our mission, cumulative, is to actually enable the kind of transformation. And your last comments reminded me that organizations are, like organisms, they are adaptable. Right? I mean, and part of the organisms and the organizations have internal adaptive resources, and our job collectively is to harness those resources to then create that type of transformation that we want. I want to thank you, Jono. I want to thank everybody who joined us in this conversation today, especially because it took a little longer than we had originally scheduled. That's always appreciated that you're hanging in there with us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, took something useful out of it, and we look forward to hearing and engaging more with you around what that might be. So have a great remainder of the day. Thank you, Jono, very much, and we'll look forward to more.
Thank you so much.